That's entirely too kind of an introduction, but I appreciate it. I've really enjoyed this series. I've got to participate in a couple of the other talks just to listen in. I thought Burke set the stage really nicely and talking about his thoughts about managing for reproductive efficiency in a cow herd. And then, I really enjoyed Dr. Prather's talk as well. And of course, Jared Decker talked here a couple of weeks ago as well from University of Missouri. So that you've had a good lineup. I hope I don't ruin the whole thing, but my topic today is to talk about synchronization and artificial insemination and the tools that we have. And I guess I'm going to take it in a direction that maybe is going to seem like a rabbit trail at first, but I'm going to talk about systems quite a bit, really. And we'll go more down this road, but I think these tools are either a distraction for a commercial ranch, quite frankly, or an extremely valuable tool when they fit into a context or a system that makes sense. And so I want to make sure that we get that context right, we get that system perspective before we really talk about the tools themselves, because apart from that, in my opinion, they don't really have a lot of value. So what is that context and what is that system? Missouri has some of these numbers as well, but I wanted to use something that I thought would be a little bit more relevant to Oklahoma State. And so I pulled up this morning. I was going to use your all's numbers from your enterprise budgets that Oklahoma State, Ag Economics Extension puts together, and it's a very good tool. I would encourage you to look it up. And not surprisingly, your extension folks come up with very similar numbers to ours in our Southern Missouri beef cow-calf planning budget. And so what I wanted to show was what is the profitability in terms of projections for 2021. What do those actually look like for commercial cattle producers? I think they're pretty concerning. So in our Southern Missouri cow-calf planning budget for 2021, for example, they have a fall calving cow losing $116 in terms of income over operating costs. A spring calving cow losing about $78 in terms of income over operating costs, so negative income there. And that's just operating costs. Okay, that's not total costs of production that include our overheads and our costs of ownership of the farm or ranch and some of those things that are hard to individualize to a cow, but obviously factor into our overall economic position. For years, I think we've talked about how farmers and ranchers that do things the way that they've always been done and follow typical production paradigms are actually hemorrhaging a little bit of equity when we start to consider total costs, these overheads and these ownership costs that maybe we don't factor into operating. But when you're starting to lose this much money in just an income over operating costs, that's a pretty stark situation for the commercial cow-calf world to be in. Now, I always point out, if you go in and you look at this budget, or you look at the Oklahoma State version as well, which in a lot of respects is very similar, you'll find very typical costs of production. And I don't know if any of you all listen to the Dave Ramsey program, for example, on the radio, but kind of a financial guru. I'm not advocating necessarily anything that Dave Ramsey says, but one quote of his that I really like a lot is that normal is broke. And that's true in the cow-calf world too. If you do everything the way that everybody else does it, on average, the cow-calf sector from a commercial perspective is hemorrhaging not only equity, but here just outright cash. So to put that in a little bit of perspective, I think it's interesting to ask the question of, well, why? What is it exactly that we're getting so wrong as an industry? So if you look at, these are some numbers that Jim Garish pulls together. Jim Garish is a fairly well-respected forage manager, and he takes one perspective, and I think there's more to it than that. But I think this is a nice set of numbers to illustrate the point that he makes, which is, if you look at this 40-year stretch of time from 1973 to 2013, and you look at, well, what did things like a large round hay baler cost? What did diesel fuel cost? What did nitrogen fertilizer cost? What did labor cost? And you adjust that up to 2013 dollars. It's pretty clear that the cost of those inputs has way outpaced just regular inflation. And if you look at the fed cattle price from 1973, which was actually kind of a high year, to 2013, we have not even remotely kept pace in terms of the fed cattle price that we would expect it to be if it was just based on inflation. So I have a couple takeaway points from this. I know Jim Garish has his own takeaway points from this, but just as a reproductive physiologist, I'll throw out a couple ideas. The first one is, if I can get it to pop up here, we have to be more efficient converters of energy into pounds of calf. And if you think about all of these inputs, at the end of the day, they're just energy with a price tag on it of some form, whether it's a set of minerals that we've mined and turned into a large round hay bale, or whether it's fuel that we've pulled up and refined and turned into a fuel source. At the end of the day, it's all energy, and a lot of it is old energy. And what I mean by that is it's old sunlight. We're running on old sunlight, and we got to be more efficient users, particularly of that old sunlight. And the other piece is that old sunlight is getting more and more expensive. And I think that's just a reality and something that we have to have in the back of our head as we think about what beef production looks like, not only next year, but 100 years from now. So I wrote an article for Beef Magazine that I think lays out some of my thoughts, and I think they put it in the print issue here in December or January, but I included a link to the online version as well. A lot of the problems that I see that we face are problems with our habits and our systems, and they're not necessarily any one thing. So when I talk to you as a reproductive physiologist today, I'm going to talk about repro, right? But that's just one little corner of a bigger story that I think we have to address. And sometimes those things, not sometimes, every time, those decisions that we make have these little cascading impacts and these little ways in which they touch on another piece of our operation. And so, for example, in this article, I'm arguing that a long calving season ends up causing a long hay feeding season. We don't necessarily think that those two things are related, but I think they are. And so when we think about the major problems with our cost structure as commercial producers, I think that reproductive management ties into it a lot more than we think. I know we often think that, feed costs are the main thing that we have to watch out for. But I think reproductive management and sometimes our failure to manage reproduction effectively ends up driving these high feed costs. So if you look at some data from the Kansas Farm Management Association, this is from 2012 to 2013, and they do a nice job of collecting some surveys and then asking some questions about that survey data that they get back in. And so if you look at farms for their gross income minus their total variable costs, so that being returns, in that period of time, 2012 to 2016, it's pretty fascinating if you look at what the most profitable producers actually did. The high profit producers drove up gross income and they drove down total variable costs. Now, I think that's different than what we sometimes read when we read a popular press magazine, and we often are faced with this idea that you got to choose between a low input paradigm or a high productivity paradigm. I've never really bought that. I think you have to do both. And I think the data supports that you have to do both. We have to find ways to be premium, high quality, high productivity producers and do it at such a cost that gross margin is really acceptable and profitable. And so how do we do that? How did these producers do that? How do we do that as an industry? So from my perspective, the challenge is not get bigger. In a lot of industries, that is the challenge, right? In a lot of industries, the name of the game is economies of scale and get big enough that you can spread out your fixed costs over more units of production. And there are situations in which that makes sense in the beef cattle world, and I'll give you that. But on the whole, if you're losing this much money over just operating costs per commercial cow as projected in 2021, having more cows makes you lose more money faster. And I think the goal has to not be to increase the number of cows on the operation. And it's easy. I think part of it's just human nature. Cows, for years and years and years, we could argue millennia, have been a status symbol. Livestock, flocks, and herds. That's how we used to talk about wealth. I don't think that's how we make a profitable operation, is necessarily to get bigger. Instead, I think it's to increase that spread between income and cost of production. So increase that, what in financial terms we would call gross margin per unit, revenue minus costs of goods sold. So we do that by moderating annual cow carrying costs, which is feed. Cow depreciation is a major one, and a lot of our cost structures, we just don't always see it. Development costs of females really can factor into that as well. Then also increase the productivity per unit of production. And what I would say is that's per some kind of standardized unit of animal production. So maybe 1,000 pounds of cow, not just a cow or acre, or just total ranch productivity. And then increasing the value of the product. So what is the price per pound of that calf marketed? My pitch today in talking about synchronization and AI is that reproduction drives so much of that equation about gross margin per unit in the commercial cow-calf world. Obviously, it doesn't give you license to break the bank on feed costs if we have good reproductive management. But reproductive management can really accelerate our ability to have a feed structure that also makes sense as well. So if I think about a cow, a commercial cow, what are the major determinants of her ability to produce gross margin? So one is feed costs. I made that point already, but how much in my state, and I would tend to think in Oklahoma as well, we're mostly concerned with winter feed costs. That's certainly the case in Missouri, where our days on feed in the winter are really where we incur substantial costs. We often have a rule of thumb that there's about 3 months of the year where we incur about 60% of the feed costs for the cow for the year. And that's typically January, February, March. Then cow depreciation, I'm not going to talk about that today, but it's something I'm passionate about. How many years does she conceive, calve, and wean a calf before being cold? What I am going to spend a lot of time on today is age of calves weaned. How early does she conceive during the breeding season? Therefore, how old and therefore how heavy are her calves at weaning? Weaning weight is important. It's not a distraction, but achieving that weaning weight through genetics is not the only way that we achieve increases in weaning weight. A big piece of weaning weight is how old are the calves at weaning. And a big piece of that is how uniformly early in the calving period were those calves actually born. A calf will gain about 1.7 to 2.2 pounds per day from birth to weaning. And so these differences, even just in 20 days of age, can really be pretty substantial in terms of their impact on weaning weight. And then lastly, obviously the quality of the calves matter. How much do her calves capture based on health, growth, performance, carcass merit, and even things like visual appearance. And obviously that factors into how we market calves. So I'm going to show a couple illustrations of this to just try to make my point before we get into the nuts and bolts. So if you think about what I would call a fairly well-managed breeding season, 60-day breeding season. Most of us would consider that to be fairly short, certainly compared to maybe what some of our neighbors do, right? So a cow that conceives on the first day of the breeding season, calves on around the first day of the calving season. If we think about gestation, like 283 days, well, that next breeding season has to start about 85 days after calving. That's just biologically, if we're going to maintain the same production calendar year round, it has to happen then. So this cow that conceived on the first day of the last breeding period, calves on the first day of the calving season, she goes through this period that we would call postpartum anestrus. She's not cycling. She's not having normal estrus cycles. This is influenced by all sorts of things, her body condition score, the presence of the calf at side, lactational output, age of the cow. It's influenced by several things. But this cow that calves early has a sufficient period of time in most cases to begin cycling prior to the start of that next breeding season. And so if you think about that in a 60-day period, 60-day breeding season, not only does she have an opportunity to become pregnant early on in that breeding period, but also even if she doesn't, she has multiple opportunities to become pregnant during that same during that 60-day breeding period. Now consider though, and again, I would call this a well-managed breeding season. I think most of us would, a 60-day breeding season. The cow that conceives on the last day of the breeding season, calves roughly on the last day of the calving season, there's a period of time in that next breeding season where she is not even cycling, not even capable of becoming pregnant, unless we really do some interventions, but not even capable of becoming pregnant. And she maybe gets one, maybe gets two opportunities to breed during that next breeding season. That's a problem. It's a problem because we don't get every cow to conceive even with just one service. We have an embryonic loss in a reasonable proportion of cases. And if we don't give animals multiple opportunities to conceive, we have higher rates of them that are not pregnant. So my question is, well, which cow falls out of the herd faster? If we're going to talk about cost structure and put this into economic terms, which cow of these two has the higher annual cost of depreciation that we would have to count against her? Which cow falls out of the herd faster and therefore costs more every year to maintain? Just like if you bought a pickup truck and you got 2 years out of it instead of 5 years out of it, obviously the truck you own for 2 years is more expensive. Well, just like that, the cow that conceives late is more expensive, just in terms of depreciating her value out because of when she conceives and when she calves. Now, here's some of the real world data on that. This is some data that looks at the percentage of cows that fail to calve next year, simply as a result of when they calved this year. So the cow that calves, for example, from day 1 to day 20, fairly unlikely to fail to have a calf next year. But we see this stair-step relationship, right? And that begins fairly early on, and we see that same relationship all the way through. Long calving seasons are really problematic. And even in these, what we would call well-managed calving seasons of 60 days, we're leaving potential productivity on the table simply as a function of when those animals conceive. Now, why do I show this? Well, my favorite part of this data set is it's a 1958 data set. We've known about this for a long time. And yet we still see a fairly substantial proportion of the industry have very extended length calving seasons and very extended length breeding seasons. Here's a little bit more modern data, 2013. This is some data from actually South Dakota herds, commercial herds. There's also a pretty large data set from the U.S. Meat Animal Research Center with even larger numbers and similar type of relationship. A heifer that conceives in her first 21 days stays in the herd a lot longer on average than the heifer that conceives after that point. And if you look at just the percentage of heifers remaining in the herd, 100% there in year 1 in both. So this is only looking at the heifers that conceived. But you can see there in year 2, the heifers that conceive later in this dashed line fall out at a faster rate. I think we know that, right? You'll talk next week about reproductive management in 2-year-old cows. It's a critical challenge that we face as an industry, just because of the cost of those animals and the value that we can lose if they're open. But if you talk to the quote unquote the old timers, what will they tell you? They'll tell you that often the challenge is getting the third calf from the female, and that bears itself out in this data set, and that is that we have a very high fallout rate in 3-year-olds as well, substantially higher if they were later conceiving as heifers. And so this idea of 1 year's breeding season really influencing next year's breeding season potential because of this effect of when females calve is a really important concept. I often say, if a year wasn't so darn long, if instead of 12 months, our cattle production cycle was 12 days, I have no doubt that we would see that. We would see that effect of when a heifer conceives, X number of hours later. It would be obvious to us that she is going to have a less long, productive life in the herd. But because it's so long, I think we tend to forget that. So same set of 2 cows, right? Let's think through another financial question in terms of the fundamental economics of the farm or ranch. That later conceiving animal versus the earlier conceiving animal. Well, which cow brings in the most revenue? Which cow weans a heavier calf? It's pretty obvious that the earlier conceiving female wins a heavier calf this year, but she also weans more total pounds of calf moving forward because of several things, but because of that multi-year effect. So once a cow starts to move later into the calving period, it becomes challenging to get them to move up and conceive earlier in future years, again, without some interventions with reproductive technology. So this is that same data set in heifers. And if you look at when the heifers conceived their very first year, those heifers that conceived in the first 21 days weaned a heavier calf than those heifers that conceived in the next 21 days and the next 21 days. That's that black bar versus the gray versus the white bar. Okay, but now these are the same heifers, but different calves, right? So based on when they conceived in their very first year, what happens with the weaning weight of their second calf? They also wean a heavier calf their second year, and their third year, and their fourth year, and their fifth year, and their sixth year. So what does that tell me? That tells me that if I want females that have inherent potential to produce gross margin per unit because they wean the heavier calves, not based on their genetic potential for weaning weight necessarily, but based on when they conceive during the breeding season, I can really influence that with my heifer selection practices. I can really influence that with my reproductive management of cows year in and year out to ensure that I'm keeping the cycle skewed towards earlier conception. So I sometimes ask this question, well, what's the most valuable reproductive technology? And I spoke to our Missouri Cattlemen's Association at their annual meeting here over the weekend, and I got some funny answers, so I'll share a couple of them with you. But I think the funniest one was feed. What's the most valuable reproductive technology? Feed. I got a kick out of that. And one person said, well, it's a manager. And gosh, that's a good answer, isn't it? That the most valuable reproductive technology is a manager. And I tend to agree with that. It wasn't exactly the answer I was going to give. And sometimes I joke, if you ask me on one day, I might give you a different answer than the next day. But let's think for a second here about the word technology, because when we talk about synchronization and AI, as we're talking about today, those are technologies, right? But what does the word technology really mean? We always think it's this kind of stuff, right? We always think it's a wheel or a light bulb or a cell phone. But those are inventions, right? And those inventions are a form of technology, but that's not really what technology is. Technology, if you break it down, it really comes from this idea of an art or a craft, and then a systematic approach to doing that. And so it's really about thought processes. It's really about the way that we think. And so it's a definition that's floating around out there that I sure like a lot is that it's a systematic application of knowledge for a practical purpose. And I think that's the most valuable reproductive technology right there on the right side of the screen. It really is the thought process behind the tools that you use. And so, if we're going to use a cedar, or we're going to use prostaglandin, or we're going to use an estrotech patch, or whatever it is, when we use those tools, those technologies, those inventions, we really have to use them in the context of a system that makes sense practically. And I think that system has to be focused on shortening the calving season. And we have several ways to do that. One is we can use the shorter breeding season. And the other one is that we can market late conceiving females based on a pregnancy diagnosis. You could also market late calving females, and in some cases it may make sense to do that in some years. I'm going to suggest that often we're money ahead to actually move those females off the farm, but that's a different debate for a different time. The main thing is that when a female is deemed less than productive in terms of our context, our thought process about how we manage for a short length calving season, when we've identified that female as unproductive compared to the rest of the herd, we got to figure out a marketing strategy for that female. And it may not be today. We may not have to sell her as a pair, and take what we perceive as a hit. We may not have to sell her as an open female. Maybe we try to upgrade her value and breed her for a different season or something like that. All of those may be acceptable strategies, but at the end of the day, she needs to be quote unquote dead to you. You know, she needs to be identified as an animal for market. And culling cows is really not a failure. And I think it feels like a failure because it's an asset that we own, but it's really not a failure. It's an opportunity to free up free up our equity that we have tied up in these animals that really are not the best investments, and then redeploy that equity into a more profitable investment. And I really think that the cow herd will never reach a level of productivity that you don't cull for. At some point, all of this has to come down to culling. And maybe that's the most valuable reproductive technology, or at least an answer I might give you on one day. But we really do have to be ruthless cullers for reproductive productivity. And I think reproductive management, in terms of the technologies that we use, the tools that we use, synchronization and AI, helps us identify fewer of those long-term. But ultimately, we have to do that because the calving season just doesn't get spontaneously shorter. I've started to preach this a lot lately in the state of Missouri, and I think it has some relevance in Oklahoma and the surrounding states as well. But, you know, our real opportunity to generate value, again, is probably not in running the maximum number of cows and doing that by carrying a lot of lower productivity cows, but instead it's focused on producing the maximum amount of calf value. And we often are better off doing that in a way where we actually feed calves directly rather than feeding a lot of cows that tend to be lower productivity. And so it's a different perspective, but the phrase I always use is grass sells a lot better wrapped in calf hide than it does in cow hide. And so if I only have so much forage to allocate, let alone equity to allocate, I'm going to put it in profitable enterprises. And sometimes that may mean diversifying the operation and not just being a cow-calf producer, but carrying calves longer after weaning, or bringing in stockers seasonally, or thinking about a heifer development system where I maybe develop a larger proportion of the heifers and I put value on growing animals directly. There's all sorts of strategies that are just better than carrying more late conceiving or even open cows just for the sake of having the quote unquote right cow number. And that could be things like, in my state, especially, I'm a big advocate that, you're better off getting rid of these lower productivity cows and extending the length of the grazing season, feeding less hay and supplement, or adding, again, as we mentioned, additional weight to calves post-weaning, or even just purchasing in, a highly productive early conceiving cows as replacements, rather than carrying these lower productivity cows. And of course, a stocker enterprise is worth considering as well. Okay, I'm going to get a little bit more into the nuts and bolts now that I think we talked about the context. Excuse me. So in terms of front loading the calving distribution, this is a concept that I think is really important when we think about where the value of an AI program actually comes from. And really, this is more the value of a synchronization program, admittedly. And that's where a lot of the value from AI does come, is it comes from the use of synchronization that we use to facilitate AI. So I have two illustrations here. These are, first of all, two herds that achieve an identical total calving rate. So ultimately, the same pregnancy rate is attained there on the right. And I put it fairly high, 90%. Now, in these two hypothetical herds, the black bars represent a herd that received a fixed time artificial insemination on day 0 with a pregnancy rate, I believe, of 63% in this case, and then was exposed to natural service for 2 estrus cycles. The striped bars represent a herd that was exposed for natural service, no synchronization, for 84 days in this case. Okay, so what happens? Total pregnancy rate's the same, but you got to understand how different these herds really are. And that's the problem sometimes when we talk about pregnancy rates, is it really doesn't tell us all that much. We really have to look at pregnancy distribution or calving distribution. When are these pregnancies occurring during the breeding season? That matters a lot more than just if pregnancies occur. So for example, the calves that conceived a fixed time AI, you see that big bar there, you see the next cycle and what happens with conception there. And then we have some conception later in that next cycle as well. And then you see that spread to the natural service bars. Well, what does that then translate then to then, if we assume some typical birth weights and rates of gain from birth to weaning. I use 2 pounds here and a 70-pound birth weight. Now, if you just look at this, I think it's pretty telling. So in this case, some more information on how it's modeled exactly is put at the bottom. But what actually happens is that short front-loaded calving distribution, despite the fact that they produce the same number of calves, produces about 10% more calf weaning weight for that group of animals. So that's a 10% increase in weaning weight. Gosh, if I was offered a 10% increase in a return on investment from any other or revenue, I guess in this case, but a 10% increase in revenue for any business is an extremely promising opportunity that deserves looking into, even if it does have some costs associated with getting there. So that 10% increase in revenue, by the way, is occurring without owning more cows, without increasing the feed costs associated with those cows. And really, if you think about these two situations, these cows cost about the same to maintain all year long, right? But very different levels of productivity because of when pregnancy is occurring during the year. So here's some real world data that backs that up in terms of that illustration. This is some data on the left side of the screen from the Thompson Research Center in Northwest Missouri. It's a straight bred Angus herd, very focused on use of reproductive technologies. My predecessor at Missouri, who was also my chair of my graduate committee on my PhD program, was Dave Patterson, and he had a really good impact at that farm over the years. Took them from using natural service to using fixed time AI, and really accomplished a lot of good research there along the way. So if you look at the red line, use of natural service in that herd, this is the average distribution in terms of what percentage of the calves were born by a certain day of the calving season. In that red line, first of all, you see a very well managed natural service program, first of all, and it's certainly possible to have one. To do natural service programs very well. You can see them get up to about an 85 to 86% total pregnancy rate there by day 46. That's very impressive. But when does pregnancy occur still remains a question. If you look at when pregnancy begins to occur in the years in which they move to estrus detection and AI, so use of synchronization and use of AI following estrus detection, and then ultimately use of synchronization to achieve a fixed time AI, look how those lines begin to shift to the left. In other words, we're shifting to an earlier calving distribution. We're getting more calves on the ground earlier in the calving season. The area between those lines is so much added productivity. If you really think about what that represents, that's additional pounds of calf weaned, additional age of calf weaned, irrespective of the fact that in these AI systems, we're also achieving calves that have the genetic merit of whatever AI sire was used, right? Well, in addition to that genetic merit, we've also added just commercial productivity from the standpoint that we've added calf age. So that's some Missouri data. If you look at some data from other states, this is some data that Vitor Marketing, who's now at Virginia Tech, put together when he was working with Cliff Lamb at Florida in the Panhandle in a little town called Marietta, and the North Florida Research and Education Center down there. The blue columns are some similar type of data, just natural service years. And then in 2008, they began to impose some use of synchronization, some use of strategic culling, maybe a little bit more informed decision-making about replacement heifer selection. There's more to it than just use of AI. But look what happens in the productivity of that herd in terms of them beginning to work their way down, shift to an earlier calving distribution. So not calving earlier in the year necessarily, but having more calves born early within that calving season. And then the per head increase in value that happens. This is really critical to understand. When we use AI, we're making a long-term investment. When we use synchronization, we're making a long-term investment. We are not just achieving AI pregnancies the next year. We're setting up a system that if we stick to it over time, we begin skewing this distribution earlier and achieving additional value of calf weaned. I mean, you go down here 6 years after they begin using estrus synchronization and AI, and they're still adding to that value in progressive years of using that technology and those management approaches. Okay, so I was asked to, this is a mean slide to show over a lunchtime series. I know, I apologize for that, but when I think about estrus synchronization and AI, I think it's important to keep in mind that we're baking cookies. Okay, we're following a recipe, and these systems are really pretty well calibrated and pretty well figured out, and we have really good tools to make pretty high quality cookies, if you will. And that's what we're trying to do with estrus synchronization AI. And so I'm going to refer you to a bunch of resources, and some of them are MU extension resources. I'm sure Oklahoma State has some similar resources. This is our guide to estrus synchronization products. And this just presents all of the available products that are, for use in estrus synchronization programs, and also has some videos embedded in there about how to actually use those. So for example, if a seeder is not something that you've used before, you can go watch a 2-minute video on here, and you will feel very comfortable about using that. It also has a table of all of the different prostaglandin products, for example, or DNRH products, and what the appropriate dose is of those and how to administer those. Same in terms of the video content is also available on our YouTube channel, OSU Repro, or our Facebook page. I sure enjoy interacting with folks on there. We've got a pretty substantial number of followers on both of those now, and it's just a good way to keep in touch. Honestly, you can ask me questions there if you'd like to, or just follow that for updates and videos. The other resource I would point you towards is a set of extension materials that we put out every year now that provide recommendations on use of artificial insemination and use of estrus synchronization in various contexts. And this is maybe a little bit more detailed than some of the other information that is available and that you might see, for example, published in an AI catalog from the Beef Reproduction Task Force or something like that. A lot of the content is very similar because a lot of the protocols recommended are similar, but it is organized a little bit differently, and it shows you some different strategies for how to actually perform AI when using any one of these systems, and gives a little bit of written guidance just about when a system might make more sense than others. So I'd refer you to that. We have one for cows here. And I know Dave is going to make all these slides available after the fact too, so you can certainly find those in the PDF version of this as well. One for heifers here, and then one for use of sex-sorted semen. I'm not going to talk about that today, but if you are interested in use of sex-sorted semen, that's available as well. And then also with natural service, I mentioned a big advantage of our AI systems is simply the fact that we use synchronization to facilitate AI, and synchronization has a lot of benefits in and of itself for generating more pregnancies early in the breeding period. So there's a fairly complete guide to natural service bull breeding when using estrus synchronization there as well. In addition to that, though, I do want to share some of the research that's come directly out of my research program here in the last couple of years, and this relates to a new protocol for beef cows. And I say that a little bit cautiously when I say new, because I really owe a lot of our program, my students, I really owe a lot of credit to other folks who have really researched topics somewhat similar to this in the past. There was some great data that came out of Ruben Mapletop's program up in Canada, for example, a number of years ago. There was some nice data out of Colorado State that looked at a somewhat similar question, and really even a lot of the dairy data that has looked at pre-synchronization has really set us down this path. But for several years now, I have really felt that our fixed time AI strategies, although they're very effective, leave a little bit to be desired in terms of the actual pregnancy rates that we get, and partly because of the fact that we're inseminating every cow at a predetermined time, whether or not she's expressed estrus. And the data is very clear that females that don't express estrus prior to AI have less than optimal pregnancy rates, have slightly higher rates of embryonic loss, and so on and so forth. And one challenge that we were seeking to address is that in these protocols, for example, a 7-day co-sync plus CEDAR protocol is a fairly commonly used protocol. I would imagine that if you are breeding cows artificially, that you're probably using that protocol or something similar. Those start with an injection of GnRH or administration of GnRH. And we know that that does not have an effect across every single cow that we administer it to. And in fact, really, there's only certain windows of the estrous cycle in which GnRH is actually effective. The dogma on that is it has to be about a 10 millimeter follicle or larger. That's not exactly true. It has to be physiologically mature and have enough LH receptor expression. But for the most part, if you think about that size way of thinking about it, there's just certain windows of the estrous cycle in which females don't have large enough follicles to respond. And so if you look across the literature, it's pretty variable. Often the literature cited is that about 65% of cows will respond to that GnRH and 35% will not. There's certainly publications where it's worse than that and publications where it's slightly better than that. But in general, that's the rule of thumb that I often talk about is, I can get a pretty good response when I have a large follicle that's responsive to GnRH. But if I happen to have cows in that group, and I always will have some that are in this stage of the estrous cycle, I don't really effectively control the estrous cycle with GnRH. Now, that 7-day co-sync plus cedar protocol is very effective. It's a great strategy if you want to handle cows just 2 times before artificial insemination. And I would not discourage anybody from using it. We're trying to achieve something a little bit better, either to facilitate use of sex-sorted semen or just to generate really high pregnancy rates with conventional semen. And so a couple of my graduate students, Rachel Bonaker and Carson Anderson, over the last couple of years have done some really nice work in Missouri and Kansas and South Dakota with over 3,000 beef cows on over 20 producer operations. And really the full range of cow age and parity and condition and length postpartum. And we've used a couple of our University of Missouri Agricultural Experiment Station beef herds as locations to do really intensive work and understand what's going on from an ovarian and endocrine perspective as well. I'm not going to show that data and get into those weeds today, but I'll show you I think what you're probably most interested in it, which is, well, first of all, what actually are we doing? And then second, how do the cows actually respond? And so here's what we're actually doing. It's an administration of prostaglandin at cedar insertion, which is a little unusual. Most protocols do not start with prostaglandin at cedar insertion. That's the weird part. But then wait 7 days, give GnRH. Cedar remains in place. Wait an additional 7 days, give prostaglandin, and remove the cedar. And then time to AI occurs at 66 hours later. I'll show a fancier schematic here in a second. But in terms of explaining what's actually happening, this prostaglandin on the front end of the protocol induces luteolysis among the majority of cycling cows. So in cows that have a prostaglandin responsive CL, this really effectively induces luteolysis. That's about 75% of the cycling cows are going to either respond to that prostaglandin or respond similarly because they've already lysed their own CL. Then whatever follicle is present at that time, if you treat a cow with progesterone at a low enough level, which is what the cedar does, that it's below her luteal progesterone production level, she will actually maintain that follicle as what we call a persistent follicle for a period of time. So we inhibit that follicle from undergoing atresia. And so if you can visualize it this way, this follicle stays around longer than it otherwise would have. And so that at GnRH, instead of having this random odds of achieving a GnRH response because she was or was not in the right window, we've forced a lot of these cows to actually be in the right window by creating this unusual situation prior to that. And so that GnRH is very effective. And then the other thing that is nice about this approach is it's essentially a full reset among the vast majority of the cows, because now at the time of prostaglandin and cedar removal, the vast majority of cows have responded in such a way that they have a day 7 CL as a result of that ovulation to GnRH, and they have a follicular wave that was recruited after that ovulation occurred. And so that's the system. It's very effective in cows. This is also a system that works in non-cycling cows. It's effective in anestrus cows, but probably similar to the 7-day co-sync plus cedar if the cows aren't cycling, just because this effect doesn't occur. And so it's carried by the fact that it's so effective in cycling cows, no doubt about it. So there's again a more non-stylized version of that protocol for those of you that are interested. And again, we do have an extension publication about this work here at the link below. Here's really the exciting part, and just for you as end users of a synchronization program, is to go out the morning of the fixed time artificial insemination and have in our data set across those locations, 82% of cows express estrus prior to fixed time AI. That's really remarkable and exciting. So really exciting to see that result come from my students' work. And that, by the way, is in comparison to very good, what I would, prior to this anyway, have called very good rates of heat response prior to the 7-day co-sync plus cedar. Just to give you an idea of what some of that looks like, these are just a few pictures that we've snapped along the way using Estrotech patches. I know many of you are familiar with that, but to see those kind of heat responses on the morning of a fixed time AI is exceptionally encouraging, of course, and really the fertility that we've seen goes along with these pictures that you can see in terms of the activated patches in those groups of cows. So in terms of pregnancy rates of fixed time AI across those locations, with conventional semen on that protocol, 72% pregnant to just a single service fixed time artificial insemination. Sex semen, 52% pregnant. Now that's still, by the way, very good with sex semen with just a single service, and considering the fact that some of those animals that received sex semen were non-activated, not in heat, that's still a very good result with sex semen. So don't feel like it's not. But obviously, when you see it next to 72, it's hard to feel that way. But then the 7-day co-sync plus cedar, results that are very typical with what we would see with conventional and sex semen, 61 and 44%. So to me, and I think to a lot of the producers that we've worked with, I don't have a single location, I don't think, that has gone back to using the 7-day co-sync plus cedar. They were sold on this new approach. And then I didn't show you the data with embryo transfer today, but if you're interested in that and using this in recipient cows, there's some more information again at that extension publication about that. So this is my last slide, and I'm going to wrap up. I try not to focus too much on any one tool or any one synchronization system, even though those are some exciting results, because you take the head of a hammer and it's kind of useless by itself, right? And honestly, you start assembling tools together, like let's say strategic culling decisions for shortening the breeding season, together with that tool, and it becomes a little more valuable. You start to see how you can use that. But ultimately, the thing that matters is how you use it and driving towards that context. And so synchronization, it doesn't have value in and of itself. In fact, it has cost in and of itself. And so the question is, how do you use that? If you use it as a tool to achieve earlier conception within the breeding season, that's really where the value comes from, is when you put that tool in context. And I would say the same thing about AI. It doesn't have value in and of itself. It's a cost in and of itself. And the value comes from the value that comes from those genetics, from generating calves that are, from a specific sire or sires of interest, or that are the desired sex if you use sex semen, or whatever reason it is that you have to use artificial insemination. And really the value comes from there. It comes from putting that tool in context. And I think I've made this point, but you combine these tools together, and you combine them together with the management for a short calving season, strategic culling, heifer selection practices, some of the things that you've already talked about in this series and that you'll continue to talk about. That's where these things have value, is as a part of that to really drive up the margin in the operation. And that's what we're really trying to do, right? Is increase the total value of the calves weaned across the ranch, decrease the costs associated with cow depreciation. Didn't talk about that so much today, but I think you probably got the hints of how reproductive management really drives that. And obviously, when we create a more consistent group of calves, we create a situation that's a lot easier to manage. And there's a lot of advantages there economically in terms of labor and facilities and feed and so on and so forth. I'm gonna cut it off there. My contact information is in the top right. You're sure welcome to give me a call anytime if you want to visit. If you're interested in just some of the stuff I've written, you can find some of that on is urepro.com. That'll link you out to some of our extension resources as well. And certainly welcome to email me too. Happy to take some questions if there are any.
There are. Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Outstanding. So let's just start off with a couple of these questions here and encourage everyone else to be typing yours in if you have one. So the first one is, since I've never used AI before, can you give approximate AI cost per cow or herd?
Yes. So in terms of synchronization, a seeder is going to be depending on how many you buy at a time, somewhere between 10 would be the low end now, $10 to $14 is probably a reasonable expectation for a seeder. So you might consider $12. This is kind of an average. Dose of prostaglandin is somewhere between $2 and $4, similar for GnRH, $2 and $4. I would encourage you to use an Estrotec patch or some form of an estrus detection aid that you can feel confident about. So you add those synchronization product costs together, and you're easily in a $20 range in terms of synchronization, depending on which protocol you actually use and which products are required in that protocol. Now that said, then we have to have a philosophical discussion about, do you pay yourself for labor, and do you employ somebody else to get some of that labor done? I would normally, from an accounting perspective, probably figure about $30 to service an animal in terms of the synchronization cost, and then add in the semen cost on top of that, which could be as low as $10 and as high as whatever you wanted to spend.
Okay, very good. Next question, have you compared these synchronization methods with natural service rather than AI?
Yeah, so there's a lot of work comparing natural service and AI, and a lot of interest in systems that combine the two and how to do that effectively. I would say this from an economics perspective: if you do the math about what bulls actually cost versus what AI costs, you would want to get rid of bulls and do only AI. The challenge is, can you do that logistically, and can you do that from a labor perspective? Because believe it or not, you can generate AI pregnancies cheaper than you can generate natural pregnancies if you really count the real cost of the bull. If you count the fact that the bull eats about 1.5 to 2 times what a cow eats all year round, and you've got to carry that cost. You've got to have, in some cases, separate facilities to manage those bulls and allocate those resources there. You've got to have mineral and health programs for those bulls. You've got to fix all that stuff if the bull tears up. There's costs associated with bulls that, if you find any extension tool to calculate what a bull cost per pregnancy actually is, it's a little scary when you think about the fact that, you're only going to get so many pregnancies out of that bull in a year, and you might break a leg or something else and be gone next year. So bulls are very expensive, actually, and they're an expensive way to service cows, but they're a convenience feature. And that's maybe an odd spin on it, but they really are. And so the challenge with an AI program is, well, we're now going to incur the cost of AI. Does it actually reduce the cost of the natural service bulls that we need to own? It can, if, for example, you take if you begin to have a system in which you use AI very effectively. I'm comfortable with lower bull to cow ratios in those systems. But I wouldn't drop it to half of what I typically used. I would drop it a little bit more conservatively than that. So it is a little hard to walk through that comparison with natural service. Now, the other piece I would say, aside from a cost perspective, natural service breeding programs work very well in terms of generating early conceptions within the breeding season. I think it can be a very good step forward to begin thinking about using AI to try a very simple synchronization with natural service this year. For example, a one-shot prostaglandin protocol could be an excellent way to dip your toe in the water. A simple 7-day seeder program could be a great way to dip your toe in the water, especially if you have later conceiving cows.
Okay. Yeah, just pretty simple way to move more of those calvings into that first 21 days. All right. Next question. This one's a little longer, so you may want to read it as I go along here, Dr. Thomas. But the economic drivers that were presented seem to lean toward a bias for individual animal performance, i.e., strategies to improve calf production per cow due to the high per cow maintenance cost. Does or can this approach coexist or be synergistic with cow-calf research that is showing an advantage associated with strategies targeting return per acre? In other words, lower cow size and associated input costs with more cows per acre, improve forage utilization, and so on.
Yeah, so I actually agree with that. So I think that looking at individual cows and trying to generate the most performance out of an individual cow is a misdirection. And unfortunately, it's been one that, not to repudiate the extension specialists of years gone by, but as a younger person, I have inherited some extension publications that maybe focused more on that direction than I feel comfortable with. Because at the end of the day, we're concerned about whole ranch profitability. We're not concerned about individual animal productivity. And sometimes those things go together and sometimes they're antagonistic. And so I start to think about, milk production and mature cow size, and are we really effectively generating more revenue when we have large cows that have weaning weights that we feel are more impressive, right? So sometimes running smaller cows and having more cows per acre, I understand all of those conversations. Now, when it comes to reproductive management, though, we're talking about the cow's ability to generate, whether that calf is going to wean off at 800 pounds or 400 pounds. We're really talking about the ratio of input costs associated with a cow to saleable product from that calf. And so I think that really that question sits a little bit apart from this discussion of individual animal performance versus whole ranch profitability, because I think you really need the reproductive performance from a whole ranch profitability perspective. Because we're shouldering cow carrying costs as a major cost of production, and we have to really get the most saleable pounds of product in relation to that carrying cost. So I think those ideas meld together as opposed to being antagonistic. I don't know if that answered the question well, but it's a really good question.
All right. Well, we'll let Dean jump back on if he'd like any clarification. Next question. Let's see. So I think you've kind of already addressed this one, but Samuel asked general cost comparison of bull power versus AI system.
Yeah, I would actually say that the bull is more expensive, but it's certainly more convenient. And so it's almost a cash flow question to me more than it is in economics. So it's more of a finance question as opposed to an economics question. If facilities are extremely limiting, if I don't have the labor access to pull off AI in a straightforward way, I will agree with you. There are some situations where a bull bred program in conjunction with synchronization is going to make sense. It just is. And so I'm philosophically on the same page. Now, that said, if I had to start from scratch, I'm really going to think about an AI program, because I think the cost structure of AI moving forward is, as counterintuitive as it sounds, a little more favorable than building a program around exclusively natural service.
Okay. All right. Brian says, looks like your 46-day breeding season achieved very good pregnancy rates. What reason are there to extend to 60 or more days?
Yeah. So, let's bring it back to this context. So, at the end of the day, does it really matter what your breeding season is? It really kind of matters what your calving season is. And so there are two ways to go about that. You could do an ultra short breeding season, and by definition you'll have a calving season that's ultra short. But if the breeding season's one day, it's going to be a pretty darn disappointing calving season, despite the fact that it's short. And so that's the question: is what is the lower limit of a breeding season in terms of whether or not it really economically makes sense? So I would say this: I think it depends on what the last year's calving season really looked like. And it depends on also whether we're talking about heifers versus cows. I'm a fan of short breeding periods in heifers because I would almost rather have open heifers, depending on the cost structure of the heifer development enterprise. I would almost rather have open heifers than late bred heifers, depending on my marketing opportunities for late bred heifers. And so extremely short breeding periods in heifers, I'm never scared of. If you want to give heifers only one opportunity to conceive to AI, I understand why people would do that. That's a bold choice, but I understand the short opportunities in heifers concept. Now in cows, it's a little bit different story because we're often trying to make progress in a multi-year kind of way. So in cows, for example, I think a very reasonable thing is to use an extended length breeding season, but commit to doing pregnancy diagnosis and marketing late bred cows. And that could be marketing those cows at the time of pregnancy diagnosis, which in most cases would be as pairs. That's kind of an extreme solution. It could be something like early weaning those calves, marketing the late bred cows and feeding the calves. It could be something like waiting until weaning and marketing later bred cows at weaning. And it could be even something as wild as calving those cows out and marketing, open pairs after the calving season. There's all sorts of different strategies to go about doing that. I would only move towards very, very short breeding periods in cows if my marketing opportunities for later bred cows were just non-existent. Or I'm sure there's some other situations too, but that's typically my thoughts on that. I care a lot more about what the length of the calving season is.
Right. Okay, so I'm going to leave Chad's question for last, but Doug says, what percentage of late calving cows are the result of low serving capacity or libido of a bull rather than inherent fertility of the cow? Good question.
I don't think that we know, because I think it's dependent on several things. It'd be dependent on the bulls in question, and it would be dependent on the bull to cow ratios used. I'm a cow guy, and I will tend to blame the cow. But I think at the end of the day, for this particular set of results, the question is, does it matter, right? Because we're talking about an animal that has inherently less potential to generate, margin for us moving forward. And so that's an animal that is culled or marketed, or, we disinvest in if she's conceiving later, past whatever cutoff we've decided makes sense. Now, in terms of addressing problems, of libido of the bulls, that's, on the bull side, and we'll just have to deal with that in future years. So I guess from my perspective, I think the answer would just be that at the end of the day, we can blame some on bulls potentially, but at the end of the day, these later conceiving cows have to go from a commercial perspective just because they don't have that potential to generate margin.
Okay, so Chad's question is if I can summarize, Chad, his questions basically, I think he's referring to the 7 and 7 protocol. I could be wrong about that. It may be a co-sync, but he suggested he did not have very good results. Then he's got some associates that are suggesting, well, it may just be a timing issue relative to expression of estrus compared to when they were serviced. Should I take their advice and service cows based on response to a heat patch or just expression of estrus? Aforementioned protocol, yeah. So really that's what it boils down to. I think he's looking for some assistance to improve on his results to date.
Yeah. So first of all, sorry to hear that you didn't get along so well on a set of cows. That's never fun to hear. So let's make sure that we make some time to visit afterwards for sure. So if you want to give me a call or an email, call's probably the best. Just give me a call sometime, and I'm happy to work through what exactly it is he did. It's it's hard to say over a question, right? Exactly what the specifics are. I will say on this particular protocol, if you did use the 7 and 7 sync program, we do have early estrus activity, but it's not earlier than what we typically see with a 7-day co-sync plus cedar. It's just that we have a larger proportion of those cows expressing estrus early at this favorable time. Now, a 66-hour fixed time artificial insemination is what was done in all of our research, and that sets cows up to be inseminated at the appropriate time. Certainly can feel late to folks when you've seen all of these cows in heat and you're actually waiting a little bit until 66 hours. And so I get that. I think people see that and they almost have a gut reaction that, oh, did I wait too late or something like that. I don't think so, based on our research and based on all the results that we've seen around the country with this. But at the same time, I would love to figure out if there's a little more specifics there that we can dig into and figure out some solutions.
Don't be afraid to contact any of us, Chad. We'll get your question or contact Dr. Thomas directly. Our good friend, Dr. Edmonds, Dr. Patrick Edmonds, has this question. He says, I've identified highly productive early conceiving cattle as an asset to purchase. Are there some avenues to use to identify these type females for sale or purchase? In other words, create a premium market, assuming you have them for sale, or be willing to pay a premium if you can identify them from another source, if you're in the market to purchase.
Dr. Longman, I think, is smiling because he thinks I'm going to give a Show Me Select Replacement Heifer advertisement right here, and I might give one because I will say, whether it's identifying heifers or identifying bred cows as replacements, I look for really high information animals, and so, we always talk about high quality, and I agree, there's a lot of quality goals that we ought to have from a genetic perspective. Another thing that we really ought to insist upon is just high information. And so if I can identify females that have, been pregnancy diagnosed at a time in which that age of that fetal age could be determined, and I have a known or expected calving date on those cows, that becomes a very valuable piece of information for me, because, aside from genetic merit, one of the most important things I can possibly do is purchase females that are going to calve early within my calving season, especially for heifers, because it just sets them up for a lifetime of productivity. And so I agree with you. I would really make that it's almost a shame that we market loads of females as exposed over X period of time, because that's a pretty low information set of animals. And so identifying high information sets of animals, and or having the cash flow where you can purchase these larger sets and actually have some marketing strategies for the females that you don't think really have the long-term value for you, that can also be an acceptable way to go. Show Me Select would be one way to source some really high information females. And then another way would be to really identify producers that you can build a relationship with and ask for that kind of information and do a sort really based on those.
It's gradually getting better in our industry. I mean, Jack Whittier and I were paying attention to this kind of question, I don't know, a long time ago. But today, I mean, for example, you look at the catalog information in Superior's program, much more information there, or potentially could be there based on the producer's, willingness to provide those details, compared to our marketing system many years ago, where you walked into a sale ring or you contacted the producer directly. So, all right. Well, we're past time here. This has been an outstanding session, Dr. Thomas. Thank you again, Dr. Biggs, Dr. Beck. Do you all have any parting comments or questions?
Just want to thank Dr. Thomas again for joining us today, and invite everybody back next week for Dr. Bassett's presentation.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Thomas. Really enjoyed it. Going to highlight this in my Oklahoma Cattleman article coming up that's due tomorrow. So I really appreciate it.
Well, it sounds like you've got a busy afternoon ahead. No, thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate the opportunity to speak. I did see there was one question from Terry Ward just in the chat about use of this program in heifers, the 7-7 protocol. We addressed that a little bit in the extension publication. I've been discouraging it for now. There's just not a lot of data on that. But other than that, I think we wrapped up all the questions. So really, really appreciate everybody for putting this together.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas. Thanks everybody for joining us. If you live in Oklahoma, beware of fire danger the next 2 days. high winds and low humidity. Have a great week. See you next week.
Thank you.